Good morning and welcome to everybody. My name is Maria Grazia Quieti. I am the director of the Master in Food Studies, and as you know from our correspondence, I am the chair of the conference together with Maria Fonte. Please, Maria, stand up. That you all know probably. So we wish to welcome all of you, and also welcome back to some of you that have been in previous conferences. We are at the third conference of our Master in Food Studies. So I'm pleased now to introduce to you our Dean of Academic Affairs, Geneviève Gessert. Thank you, Geneviève, for the welcoming remarks.
Sorry. Please excuse my hoarse voice. I think many of us are experiencing a similar situation at this time of year. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the American University of Rome for this very significant and timely conference. We at the American University of Rome are especially pleased to host you here at this time because this year we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, a time in which we're focusing on our mission and expanding our outreach to our community in both local and global terms. For those of you who are with us for the first time, the American University of Rome is an American university accredited by the Middle States Commission on Higher Education in the U.S., granting degrees at both the bachelor's and master's levels. Our undergraduate programs focus on the humanities and social sciences, ranging from archaeology and classics, English writing, literature, and publishing, to communication, film and digital media, international relations, and business administration, and many others. The Graduate School of AUR is our newest division, offering interdisciplinary study in increasingly impactful fields such as sustainable cultural heritage and peace studies. Our Master in Food Studies, while only still young in its 5th year, has already matured to attract a broad range of international students and scholars, as well attested by the gathering today. How well you are fulfilling AUR's motto, which is Inter Gentes Trans Orbem, if you haven't noticed on the front of your beautiful packets, between peoples across the world, with participants at this conference from Italy, the US, England, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Portugal, the Netherlands, Latvia, Germany, Canada, Hungary, Iceland, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Australia, Bulgaria, Spain, and Argentina. Fantastic. That's not to mention the many places of origin of our attending students and staff and faculty as well. I'm especially gratified to see at this conference some alumni of our program who are already working in areas related to food production and consumption. Even more, I'm happy to see how our current MA students, some of whom we welcomed you this morning, are socially and analytically engaged, using their experiences in the program toward the improvement of our collective future. These remarkable students have prepared a plan of activities for Fridays for Future, where they will continue to work and act on the themes of this conference related to climate change and waste, reconnecting producers with consumers and others. I understand that others of you in this room are also pursuing your degrees in related fields, or are more established in your careers in academia, government, or scientific research. And I'm heartened that so many have decided to gather here in this collaborative conference format to consider such essential topics. I'm looking forward to hearing the remarks of our keynote speakers, to be sure, but perhaps even more exciting will be the discussions and outcomes of the working groups this afternoon, which are sure to produce some new ideas and approaches to sustainability as relates to food systems and diets. In this regard, I thank you all again for coming to the American University of Rome today, and wish you all a productive and enjoyable conference. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So, before we start, I'd like to say a few words on the context of our conference. When we announced it in February of this year, on the same day, the report of the Lancet Eat Commission, Food in the Anthropocene, Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food System, was published. In the summer, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its report on climate change and land. Both of these gave once more alarm signals about sustainability of the food system and of our diets. More recently, the report on the state of food insecurity in the world that is published every year by FAO, IFAD, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and World Food Programme, was a further corroboration that unhealthy diets are now the leading risk factor for deaths worldwide. I shall stop here, and taking into account the evidence built by numerous researchers in the world beyond and in addition to these reports, I shall stop here to say that the challenges to be faced are known, and we believe we all share the sense of urgency that is conveyed by these various sources. With this conference, we want to contribute to build and share knowledge, actionable knowledge, on how changes in consumption practices can impact on the sustainability of the food system. Our questions are, what are the efforts across different contexts to change food consumption practices in sustainable directions? Which policies, research and investments are conducive to fostering the desirable transformations of the food system and dietary habits and patterns? And we want to encourage critical assessment of the potential of social and technological innovations to shape production and consumption practices towards greater sustainability. We thank all the authors who are contributing to this conference with their research, and are particularly pleased to see that we have many PhD candidates and also researchers from international organizations like FAO and Biocultural International. We are also happy to see many students. In addition to the American University of Rome, we have students from Roma Tre and Amsterdam. We have received about 65 papers with research covering the theme of sustainable food system and diets from various perspectives: consumers' behavior, food procurement institutions, socio-technical innovations, place-based agricultural production, including biocultural resources and new farming practices. The cases cover countries with a wide range of different socioeconomic and ecological contexts, including Europe, of course, given our location. We have cases from Austria, Bulgaria, Finland, Germany, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Norway, Sweden and Switzerland, but also from countries as far away and as diverse as Algeria, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Costa Rica, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Palestine, Sri Lanka, Turkey, the United States, and Vietnam. We regret that some of the authors could not make it to the conference for financial and other reasons. So, thank you again, authors, present and absent. Finally, we also thank our keynote speakers that have accepted to come to our conference, our longtime friends by now, Harriet Friedmann, Tim Lang, and Colin Sage. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, Harriet Friedmann. So, Harriet Friedmann is professor, probably you all know her, but I think I need to say a long bio. She said, please don't make it so long, but I think it's good to show to other women what you have achieved. So, Harriet Friedmann is Professor Emerita of Sociology, University of Toronto. She's a food system analyst, writer, and lecturer. Since retirement in 2012, in her own words, I found this very nice evocative expression. She freely pollinates worlds of academia, policy, and activism across scales of organization. She has written many influential articles. You probably all know that she is the co-developer of the historical food regime approach, which specifies periods of power accumulation on diets on a world scale and transitions between regimes. Her recent publications are on international policies and ecological theories related to food system transformation and emergent governance across social natural scales, as cities and capital have reorganized the biosphere and the atmosphere. She's been visiting professors in many universities around the world, and I'll just mention a few: Lund, British Columbia, Michigan, Institute of Social Studies, Rio de Janeiro, Montpellier, and last but not least, she came to our, she was the distinguished speaker for the university 50th anniversary lecture series at our university. Her civic engagement includes being chair and now chancellor of the Toronto Food Policy Council, a model for many others that are coming up in the world. She serves on several editorial boards of food and agriculture and global change journals, as well as non-profit boards, like, for example, the chair of the political economy of the World Systems Research section of the American Sociological Association. In 2011, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Canadian Association of Food Studies. Her main passions now are seed biodiversity, seed food regions, commons, resilience theory, and exploring with others, with us, the present possibilities for food system transformation in the world context. So thank you, Harriet, for being with us again. Please join me in welcoming Harriet.
Thank you all. Let me just start by saying that I was thinking, as I was hearing these comments this morning, that some of this is really ancient wisdom. You know, that there's a Buddhist meditation on eating, where you think about where the food has come from. All the people, the places, the earth, the processes that have led to it. So we're just trying to get back there, but we're trying to use science to do that. Am I okay on the mic here? Okay. So, that's not right. Ooh, upside down, right? Okay. But now I gotta go back. Now I go forward. Sorry. That one and that one. I got it. Okay. I got it. All right. Okay. My theme today is we know what to do. We need to keep common sense about what is real and whose arguments to trust. But let's start with what individuals choose to eat. Expert advice is clear. We have a wonderful book. Can you hold it up, Tim? Sustainable Diet. You all know it, by Tim Lang, Pamela Mason and Tim Lang. We have the Eat Lancet report, as Maria Grazia referred to. We have all that we need to know about the relation between eating and farming and everything in between. But there are confusions. For instance, what is food? This is, I love this particular, whoops, what did I do? Okay, yeah. This quote, the shortest possible economic history of agriculture in the 20th century would be this: non-farmers learning how to make money from farming. There are many slides I've shown in some of my lectures of ads from the agribusiness corporations, the farming corporations, about all the things that corn goes into, from paint to, everything, right? And of course, biofuels is the most recent that I know of. They're inventing them all the time. So what do we mean by food? Because corn is one of the handful of crops that is traded internationally in commodity index funds, and is what is usually meant, these five together, by a food crisis or food security or measuring the amount of calories and all of those things, not broccoli, etc. So we need to be careful about what food means, and the corporate agenda, I would say, the corporate propaganda, and much of the belief systems that are deeply, deeply entrenched and locked in about what food is and what food security is and what food insecurity is, and even malnutrition. So Michael Pollan, I think he's a very good practical advisor with his 7-word advice, which is eat food, which is his definition, anything your grandmother would recognize as food. It doesn't mean what she ate. It can come from somewhere else. And not too much, and mostly vegetables. So nutritional advice supports that. Let's go to social science and policy. I love Brazil's food guide, and it's worth remembering in this time when a different government is undermining much of the beautiful work that was done for 10 years in food, in lifting people out of poverty and using public policy to support better farming in Brazil, especially for students, for schools. So the Brazil Food Guide, one of my favorite parts of it is avoid food that is advertised. And another part is eat socially, at work, in families, at school. Don't walk around eating whatever. And in the, with lots of packaging and all of that, too many items on the label. All of these things are like practical advice that have been around for a long time and that are worth remembering. Now, ecological science would add to Michael Pollan's advice, we should eat in traceable and short relations between farms and food preparers, so you can know how your eating supports your local and natural surroundings. You can also do it, this is not about being local only, you can also do it in ways like Chocosul is a wonderful organization that works directly with farmers in Oaxaca to source chocolate. They do wonderful public education on what chocolate means, cocoa means, in the cultural context of Mexico, and also how to prepare it. And they prepare it and sell it in all kinds of interesting ways, do celebrations, support, never mind, they do lots of stuff. And the last thing is to share knowledge and experiences from places, from across places who are experiencing with experimenting with aspects of this massive shift that is needed. We can call that scaling out, and the other of ecological sciences we can call scaling up. Now, the third thing is to scale deep. Oh, I don't know what slide I'm on here. Which is a cultural shift to what scientists tell us and what everyone knew until a century or even half a century ago, though they may have taken it so for granted that they didn't say it, and not to notice. This is so important. What has happened to our food system and to our land was not noticed. In Joni Mitchell's words, we paved paradise and put up a parking lot, and we keep doing it. We keep doing it. So this is outside my city, Toronto, which is farmland already converted and for sale to be converted. Our agrarian ancestors ate well, though unequally, and in relation to what their earthly homes could sustain over generations. The unequal parts were mainly meat, especially after enclosures of common fields, forests, wetlands, and so on. I'll get to money and markets later. So here's one example of ancestors. This is the famous book, which I recommend to everyone, Farmers of 40 Centuries, came out almost 100 years ago now, on farming that was sustained for 4,000 years in Asia, and it's still there barely, sometimes barely, all under threat, as Maria Grazia said. It's similar in other parts of the world, but this terraced farming is a particularly sophisticated way of doing things. It combined farming and cuisines in ways that supported renewal of the soil and sufficient, there were mistakes, but sufficient maintenance of bodily and cultural health to last all this time. They also combined wild and domestic plants and animals. They were organized in this kind of system. The forests at the top are holding the water. The water is coming down, and a very sophisticated form of knowledge is passed from generation to generation about how to maintain the flows of the water carefully. It also combines housing so that the private plots hold fish, in systems I've seen, hold the fish until it's the appropriate time to put them into the collective terraces. the fish, there are Chinese scientists now who have studied, from natural resources, not from agronomy, who have studied these systems and noticed with cameras that took long time photography that the fish actually jump up and knock the insects off the rice plants and eat them. And yet the Chinese are following our pattern on the whole of separating the two, fish farming and rice farming. So so it's important to notice that every sustainable farming system includes some kind of animals, often for labor, but always for fertilization. So frogs, fish, ducks in this system, usually a cow standing somewhere too. So they fertilize the ground, and they do all kinds of other, what we now call ecological services. So there's a cycling of nutrients. There's no waste in nature, and as Mary Douglas said, waste is matter out of place. That's where we need to be heading, is no waste. So I'll be talking more about that. And the point here too is that there's deep knowledge, that people are combining their dwellings and their individual responsibilities with shared ones. Yeah. So just a comment about cities, which I've become very interested in lately, since most of us live in cities now. Cities before 1500, and in some parts of the world yet, have a certain pattern in relation to their natural surroundings. And I found it fascinating that on the lower right there is an archaeological reconstruction of one of the abandoned cities of the Amazon. There were many. And this city, I've kind of lost my notes about how many people were in it, but there were quite a few people. And around it were fish ponds, terra preta, which is now this buried carbon that is now being rediscovered as a way to renew soil. They knew that before colonialism, and they were renewing their soil. What's so interesting is how similar the shapes are compared to Paris before 1500. That they're based around water, and I think we need to be thinking about that, about basing our dwellings around water, and about being careful, they still mostly are, being careful with the water and the watersheds that are the foundation of our lives, where we live and how we grow and get our food. That surrounding them are both the food-getting places that might be fish ponds, they might be farms, gardens, all kinds of things, plus the wild areas. And this division between rural, urban, and wild is one that we need to rethink. We need to be rethinking, because so much of a mixed diet and mixed farming system has included combinations of growing, maintaining forests and waters, as they always have been, and gathering from them or hunting. So what's important is that the cuisines, I'll do that first. It's just another example. Chinampas from Mexico, incredibly complex pre-colonial systems that go back a long time, not as long as China, but a very long time, that involve constructing mesh underneath the water. Mexico City was a big lake, as many of you know. And constructing mesh underneath to hold the mud, to continue renewing that, and growing very intensively a mix of plants in those. Now, the important thing, and Sidney Mintz gives us this anthropological view of the universal pattern of which each place is a specific variant, what he calls the core protein fringe pattern, CPF. You can get this partly out of his, the last part of his wonderful book, Sweetness and Power, where he says every agrarian system that lasted for thousands of years, I'll point out longer than colonialism has created our present world, more than 500 years. Most of those lasted, and I don't know if ours will last longer than 500 years. That every system is based on a starchy staple, That's the core, and it's complemented by a protein plant, usually lentils, beans of some kind, chickpeas, soybeans, and then fringe. And fringe is everything else. It's the meat, all the flavors, all the spices, all the vegetables, which are grown in conjunction with those two plants and which are the basis of the culinary practices and the specific tastes that are central to every culture. That the two of them work together. They renew the soil. Nitrogen is replaced in the soil that's taken out by the starchy staple, and they form a complete protein in the body when we eat them. But of course we need all those other things too, and we've rediscovered vitamins and minerals since we got rid of them pretty well for a long time by paving over all the areas around our cities. So these agrarian systems were complementary and the foundation of the way people lived and the way they ate. Now, it's also important to know that these are not place-bound. They're place-based, but not place-bound. They were not isolated. This is, I'll share these slides with everybody, don't bother about it too much. The point about this slide is that it took 2,000 years for maize to reach the southern tip of Latin America, from Central America, Mesoamerica, and it just took 1,000 years for it to reach Ontario, where I live. Now, people were moving with their plants as long as we can find information, and so it's false to think about simple breakpoints, and to think about terms like traditional invite us wrongly to think about things as being static before some present time happened. And I'll just add that one of my colleagues, Gary Crawford, who's an archaeoethnobotanist, recently discovered quinoa in Ontario. That is, it made its way from Peru to indigenous sites in Ontario and central Canada. So all of these plants were always moving. They just started moving more dramatically with colonialism, especially in settler states. But they've come back now to Europe, and they've moved out to what we call the Third World, or now the South, in the form of industrial monocultures, which at this point I'll just say marginalized other plants. And these are sometimes called orphan crops. They have different names now, and people are trying to recover them. But it's harder and harder to grow as the land is reorganized for the monocultures of this handful of crops that we've come to call food, in terms like food security, food crisis, and so on. So amaranth is one from the Americas, millet from Africa and Asia. All of this has been done through commodity frontiers, and the most recent commodity frontier, of course, is palm oil. It's mainly goes into industrial food, processed food, cosmetics, a few other things. It was, of course, completely sustainable in West Africa, where it began, as part of a mixed farming system. But now it's threatening the forests in Southeast Asia. I'd say these commodity frontiers usually import or transplant crops that are not native. That is not the problem, that they're not native. The problem is that they're transplanted and are wiping out whole other areas. When people import and transplant plants like chili peppers or tomatoes or potatoes all over the world, that can work. So, another part that I will also cycle back to is measurement. And this is an article that just appeared in Economic and Political Weekly in India by Richa Kumar. It's a beautiful article rethinking not only the Green Revolution, which has been done many times, but the kind of analysis and measurement that was done to justify certain arguments, like the insecurity, food insecurity of people in India in the 50s and 60s. And she's arguing it's because they weren't measuring these orphan crops. And they were including things like wheat, which did exist in India, but was not nearly as important a part of the diet as it became. And when they measured it, they found out there wasn't enough. They measured only part things. And then when they found out there wasn't enough, it justified immense amounts of food aid, and then importation of high-yielding varieties of certain seeds during the Green Revolution, and actually food insecurity was increased. And I won't even go into that unless you want in the questions, but so much has been written about what the perverse results of the Green Revolution were, mainly by forcing people into markets and that they can't afford to buy certain things that they had direct access to before. So we've been led astray by one-dimensional measures: calories and proteins for diet, productivity of single crops, income as a measure of poverty. I'll just add, in case people haven't thought about this, that our universal, constantly repeated refrain about poverty, $1 a day, $2 a day, completely misleads us. If people have access to food on $1 a day because they live in villages or have access to local territorial markets, they're doing much better than if they move to the city and get $2 a day and have to compete with us to buy lentils. So, what not to trust? History lessons told by power and shaped by linear ways of acting, measuring, and thinking. So, we know what to do. We know what to do. Cycles are how nature works. Water cycles, atmospheric cycles, air, exchange of gases through the bodies of plants and animals. We live in Gaia. The biosphere, we are part of it. And the earth is our food, and we go back to the earth. We know that. So what we need is to return to the original cycles that farming was. That agrarian core protein and fringe model largely fit into natural cycles. Feedbacks were relatively short in time and space. If water was overused or polluted, or land overgrazed, or too many fish taken, consequences were direct. There was no away from which things came, and no away to which waste went. Everything goes somewhere. So if we don't have feedbacks, we don't know the effects of what we're doing. So agriculture based on ecological sciences does this too. Oh, let me just go back. This is from a UNEP report. I don't know if you mentioned that, Maria Grazia, but all of the UN Environment Program, all of these UN agencies are finally discovering the importance of food to climate change, and even more to biodiversity and the relation between biodiversity loss and changes in the balance of gases in the atmosphere. So this cycle is one that shows in particular, the manure of animals, fertilizing the food that they eat, and then supporting a system that involves humans, animals, and plants working together. So industrial food systems work by an industrial logic, which is linear. They take it from somewhere, they don't have to know where, they just pay a price in the market, and it's intrinsically depleting. Because if you don't know where, you can't take responsibility for it. No feedback. It also goes somewhere. There's a product and there's waste. The product goes into markets you know not where, and waste goes into, you being the agricultural company here, and waste goes you know not where until it turns into a crisis. So some civilizations eroded soils over time. David Montgomery's book Dirt is beautiful on this. But that time was centuries, at least as many centuries as our world economy since 1500. So breaking cycles introduced linear systems and introduces them and creates the illusion of a way. So breaking cycles creates profit opportunities. The food system, like capitalism in general, creates problems and then sells us the solutions. And one of the, I would say, the deepest logic to the resistance to these changes, to getting back to cyclical systems, is that it's withdrawing from commodity relations in many circumstances. If you don't buy feed and you don't have to, and don't sell manure or send it off as waste somewhere, you're breaking the cycle. It would be wonderful, it's fun to share examples of how this logic works or doesn't work. I have plenty in my personal life we can get into. Whoops, I did it again, didn't I? Okay. There's no way that, here's a potash mine. I mean, we can have millions of pictures like this. Potash, NPK are the three industrial fertilizers that are put in. Potash is one. This is what happens to the earth away from the farm. And it's extremely limited, right? It's a non-renewable resource. And then we have our waste that we know a lot about. And all of this is supported in the financialized system that we are now in the cycle of by debt. This debt is pervasive, and I think it's one of the most important constraining aspects of everything from consumer debt to especially farm debt and the farm treadmill. Now for farmers, one of the things they've done, the most industrial farmers in North America, is to begin to reduce this. They rediscovered double entry bookkeeping, right? They said, we don't have to sell the maximum, like the banks tell us, the insurance, all of these things that lock in these farmers. If we don't have to buy so many inputs, we can still make money, right? And we'll be better off. So they started themselves doing cover cropping, using the internet to communicate with each other, to learn where to visit each other. And the problem, which I'll get to in a moment, is that it's extremely difficult to make this transition once you've been caught in this debt treadmill, which becomes an ecological treadmill as well. But what it does, it produces less nitrogen runoff and therefore less dead zones in places like the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that. Freedom from debt is really lovely. Has Freedom Farmers, it's a new book by Monica White on the history of African American farming. One of the things she discusses is the role of the farms that were owned by black farmers in the civil rights movement, because they gave safe havens to people, which were incredibly important. Also, I took an online permaculture course. It's not a very good way to do it, but it's a start. And the first thing this guy from Texas said, he said, before you even contour your land, the first thing you have to do is get out of debt. Right? So it's kind of becoming a pervasive understanding, but we need to enact it. Now, IPES Food International Panel of Experts, headed by Olivier Deschutter, has a beautiful report cited there, which explains pretty simply that to get to regenerative or sustainable agriculture, it depends where you start. So, and this answers many of the critiques that come up about where we should move. Industrial farmers need to move toward diversification, reduction of off-farm inputs, especially industrial inputs. But third world farmers in many parts of the world, who are mixed farmers and often small farmers, have been marginalized by this system. And they need help to get to. They need help from ecological scientists. I worked on the ISTAD report, intergovernment expert assessment on agricultural science and technology, UN-led some years ago, came out in 2008 or 9, and it said it just then, you know, that the way to have ecological sustainability and food security, and the part that's often left out, rural livelihoods, together, is to have a collaboration between ecological scientists, which are a special kind of scientists, different from most agronomists now, to have a collaboration between those scientists and the practical knowledge of farmers. So we need different pathways. Let me add to that some of the critiques of the technical system of industry in general, which has rarely been applied directly to agriculture. This is a beautiful little book by Baumgart and McDonough, called Cradle to Cradle, and the top's cut off a little bit. It's a tiny book, easy to read, printed on a material that does what they say, about how to design for the sustainable cyclical technosphere. And there are a couple of pieces that I'll just point out. One is that things should be designed for long life and multiple uses. So if there's going to be packaging, let's have packaging that, for instance, can be used for building materials or something else afterwards. Design it that way from the beginning. But even more, don't try to move in the direction of not producing anything toxic. When we talk about cyclical economies now, the first place that governments go is waste. Let's stop producing the waste. Let's stop producing things that the earth cannot absorb. Now, there are efforts going in that direction, but it's really important to point that out, that it's talked about with industry. Now, there are examples, and they're beautiful YouTube lectures by McDonough and so on, that I really highly recommend, that they always have plants as part of it. Always. And sometimes they're absorbing waste from canals in China, or various things that plants can do. But often they don't integrate agriculture. So many of the ecological understandings that we have been separate, industry and agriculture. So let's go back to that the original cyclical economy that we have, which is based in agriculture, included plenty of crafts, plenty of pottery and textiles and all the things that we need to use as part of these systems based in the land and based either in what's grown or what's gathered. And again, the distinction should not be too exaggerated. So, in order to do that, we have to break our addictions. This book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, how many people know this book? That's a good one. So the author, Michael Moss, is a renegade, maybe retired or something, from the food industry, and he talks about addictions, and he says that Coke executives talk about their customers amongst themselves as users. So there's plenty of evidence coming now about the addiction to processed foods in general and each of the elements. Farmers are also addicted, even in addition to being reinforced. The soil, reinforced by banking and government advice and so on, that the soil becomes addicted to these industrial inputs, and transitions are difficult. Our favorite person who's made a transition from monocultural tobacco to a beautiful agroecologist in my region, in Ontario, Brian Gilvesi, he said, when he lectures, he said, I had to get off the jug. He meant the chemicals that the companies were selling to him. And it wasn't easy, and the weeds come back worse, but he was able to do it because his friend, who's a conservationist, conservation biologist, works for the government, advised him. He said, it's gonna get worse. It's gonna get worse, but then it'll get better. And it did. And he integrates wildlife habitat, native pollinators, all sorts of things into his production. All of this, of course, is based on fossil fuels. I just went past that slide, and we know the problems with that. So getting off fossil fuels in agriculture could be an important part of getting off fossil fuels in general. So in that, if we do all that, agriculture can become regenerative. It can become a matrix for rebalancing all the species on Earth. Science has come out with a recent report on how much of the biomass of large animals, us, cows, pigs, a few others, has replaced all the other animals in the earth. And there's no reason we can't live together. Well, maybe there are too many of us, but if we can certainly reduce the number of our cows and our pigs and our chickens and eat less meat, as Colin was telling us. To be a responsible steward of the land is to use farming in ways that fit with and support the cycling, the regeneration of ecosystems and the habitats in which we all live. So we need to be able to think about metabolism, the exchange of materials and energy between not only organisms but also human settlements and our environments. And we need, therefore, to grow, to farm in ways that integrate plants, animals, and wild things within and sometimes far from cities. We need to replace these monocultural fields that are feeding intensive livestock operations with grazing animals, the way that bison once grazed the prairies of North America in the tens of millions. Integrate our core crops with mixed systems of diverse plants and animals, use soil and water wisely, and adapt to change. And farmers have been doing this for thousands of years. Now they can't do it. They're too dependent on the inputs. So, two ways to do this. One, remember and support the preservation of the important crops in everybody's diet, for instance, potatoes, in their original places of origin. This is the potato park in Peru by the Asociación Andes, and it is on land given by the Peruvian government for this purpose. It's a public park to support biocultural diversity and the renewal of the biocultural landscape and the diversity of the potatoes that continue to adapt in the places where they originally came from. At the same time, potatoes are in diets everywhere in the world that I know of. And there are two ways to do this. So very simply, the wrong way is the way it was done in Ireland, the first colony of Britain, where it was a big part of a class and colonial system that forced the people who were working on the land to grow wheat, forced them to grow potatoes for their own subsistence. The potatoes themselves became much more homogeneous, vulnerable to blight, which then happened, producing the famous Irish potato famine and the migration. There's another way to do it, and it's being done everywhere. These are permaculture fields in the UK, where they're planted as part of mixed systems and can renew the diversity. So, returning to measures, we need to measure differently. Again, the IPES food report, From Uniformity to Diversity, suggests the different way to do it. It's more complex. It's really easy to measure, well, it's not so easy, but it's relatively easy to measure calories that people have. It's very easy to measure money, the monetary flows. So that's what we like to do. And it allows standardization. But if we really need diversity among places, as well as within each place, then we need to measure differently. We need to think of efficiency in terms of ecosystem services, in terms of livelihood resilience, in terms of nutrient content. And so we know what to do. To eat sustainably, we need regenerative farming. We need to exit from one-dimensional thinking, no demon foods or savior foods, no broken cycles. That's where we have to head. We have to recover ancient universal principles for getting human food in relation to natural cycles. I recently heard from Professor Almaguedo, I think his name is, who's the champion of the potato park in Peru, that the networks of indigenous people have agreed on three principles that are universal, even though they're applied specifically in each place. Relationality to all plants, to all beings, to the earth, to the waters, to the forests. Reciprocity, which goes with gratitude, and balance. Whoops. I did it again. Oh, no. Sorry. Revealing I'm not going to be able to do it. I did do it. I did it right. Okay, sorry. So all of this is a painting by a friend of mine. She's an artist, a Waldorf teacher, is to appreciate the importance of beauty. And all of those images I showed you, some of them are beautiful and some of them are not. And I think that is a human trait that helps us recognize part of what's good, what looks beautiful on the plate, what looks beautiful in the landscape, to reconstruct biocultural landscapes that are place-based but not place-bound. So, thank you.
on this